Mediopolis, Chapter 8, The Show Mysteries. Rescuing the older man from watching multiple versions of the funny children's films, although he'd seen the many versions before, the mother then returned to the lounge area, carrying a tray of drinks with her, which the elderly man was quick to grab hold of, being thirsty from all the watching. He had brought his own flask along too, and of course all the medications that he'd require for the time there, anticipating perhaps some event like this he might find a little overwhelming, since it was so long that he'd been surrounded by a family and by so many others, and not within his own place, in his own confines, and within his own company. He'd have a small drink, perhaps later, while having a little friendly chat with the mother, and perhaps a few of the others. Save the bigger drink until later, perhaps, for the later session, when he got her alone, and they could talk together, properly. Or when she got him. And maybe he'd offer her a small drink, if she felt up to it, and it seemed as if she would, perhaps. So long as he was only a little tipsy, and not too far gone, it would perhaps be okay, he felt. He was feeling a little happy now, enjoying some of the earlier talks with the older children, and with the mother too, and also enjoying some of the children's performances before it had gotten a little tiring later on. So he rationalised it would perhaps be okay to have a small drink later, to extrovert himself just a little more, with her too. Who knows, maybe he'd try and record a poem or song from the old days for her. As she'd said, that could help his application process, perhaps, if he appeared a little more casual, laid back, for the love shows that he was considering going on. Although he also feared it could equally be a risk for him. He feared appearing, perhaps, as a tragic clown or a foolish young man who was perhaps forgivable, but an older fool, an older man. He could be seen as blinded by love or drunk on sentiment, perhaps, and an older man would be much less forgiven than a younger one. And he feared perhaps going on there other people's judgments. Perhaps he'd be viewed as trying to be much younger than he really was, playing at being a younger person, and not accepting his old limitations that age brought on. Or just perhaps be perceived as childish, and just having a laugh, not taking life seriously enough. And not still in touch with his younger self, not still singing and dancing or dreaming as a child of the universe or the earth, or society, or of God, or who knows what a child of. No, perhaps either way, whether he acted too young or too older, he feared he could be judged by many. He'd try and play it by ear and eye, and see and hear how the evening went on, before deciding just how open to be with them, and about his past, and about his current situations too, and about how far to go with exploring that. With the mother especially, he would see how far he could go, to see how open that he'd allow himself to be around her, as well as allowing her to be around him, how much of her and her real problems, her real concerns and troubles, as well as her own joys, could he really cope with. He wasn't sure he had so much himself, and after so long alone, he really wasn't sure about taking on other people's concerns and problems, as well as also their funny jokes and interesting stories too. Those things he did want to hear more of, but he wasn't sure how much either of them perhaps could deal with. He didn't want to be open and open the never-ending poem that he feared she might ramble off into, not when it was so hard perhaps to close it sometimes, without giving an offence to her. After the children's performances, for the mother and her visitor, the older man, Mr. Porter, they were then out enjoying the weather, in the hot garden, playing out and about in one of their play shows, where they played the roles of various characters, enjoying dressing up in the various costumes that they had. Taking the old dressing up box out, it was a large box full of many different costumes, hats of many sorts, all sorts of different uniforms, and different wigs too. And they even some of the pets even, they became characters too in some of the story shows that they filmed for fun, just for their friends to view. They had a pet rabbit that wandered out in the garden, its hutch being moved from place to place around the lawn so that it would slowly munch various parts. Although the rabbit only ran around the grassy areas, not the concreted parts, and it didn't like to wear the costume, the collar that they would put round it, just for a laugh. It didn't even like to be held or touched, really. It wriggled free fiercely if ever anyone tried to. He was a widower rabbit himself, a couple of years older age, after all, and missing his other rabbit half, his old companion he'd spent so long with, had only known company with for so long. So much so, now he'd been alone, that the mother had agreed perhaps to consider getting him a companion after the children's pleas to her, even though she'd said no more pets some time ago. After all of the cats and that dog they'd had years ago, they'd taken up so much time, such a lot of work cleaning up after them, cleaning the hutches out, making sure they were taken to the vets regularly for the vaccinations, making sure they were let out and walked properly, especially the dog, and costing so much money. Over the years, maybe she could make an exception though, just as a one-off, for that old rabbit. Well, he wasn't his old happy self. It was sad to see him just sat there slumped so often, or just going about in a slower, lethargic way. Much more than he'd done so before. When she was sat out in the garden, she'd notice it, or that he just was more reluctant to participate and join in any of the children's shows with them. Wasn't his old happy self, not since the others that he'd been with had passed on, especially his companion. Was he too used to being alone now, though, and would never want a replacement for his past partners? Or would he perhaps find companionship with another elderly rescue rabbit? She got all the rescue animals from a local rescue centre that the animal shows had told her all about. Who knew she knew nothing about rabbits, didn't watch the rabbit shows that much? Yes, she'd gotten more interested in the cat show and the dog show, or she'd been more involved in looking after them with the older children, so had to know more about them. The younger rabbit had been more cared for by some of the middle-aged children, who mostly dealt with it on their own, with little help from herself. Who knew the mother had told the children to watch and listen more of the rabbit shows, to research more, and then let her know about it? The older children had tried, and the mother had agreed to watch some of the rabbit shows too, the ones they didn't quite understand because of their younger age, to learn more herself. And then she would do a little research on the costs as well. It was just one of many more things on the ever-growing list of things to do around the house, however. It had been left a few months, perhaps, so a decision would have to be made soon, perhaps, she decided, glancing out at the rabbit, munching away on his grass, seeming to be happy, but still alone. The elderly visitor, Mr. Porter, as he was introduced as, although he'd gone by other names before, was even known as Mr. Curtains, when that was his job many, many more years before, although he'd been a porter in his more recent history of work. Kitchen porter, hotel porter, and even a hospital porter in his latter years. Mr. Porter at the house had talked with the younger student, that is, the elder mother's children, visiting from the campuses. Talking with the young student, her son much more, and his other visiting student friends as well. Talking with them at the kitchen table, finding out about their various subjects that they were studying. Then returning to the kitchen with the mother, carrying still the tray of drinks and giving them over to the teenage students, sat talking and stopping talking to look up at the kitchen table. They began washing up then with the elder daughter, the mother and the elder daughter washing up together in their usual routine, one drying, the other washing. No one in a position there to criticise the others for leaving the washing up left around so long, so that it would be much harder to do. It took longer to clean off the hardened remains of the food. So the mother left it to soak in the sink of hot water while she cleared away the table of the dinner's remains, and the eldest daughter busied around, assisting her putting away the other items, chatting about the place, about new recipes she'd learnt, and how the food could have been adapted to some of the newer ingredients they'd discovered recently. What other vegetables could later be added tomorrow into the current mix of the stew for tomorrow's dinner show? since it was easy to add more extra visitors for later tomorrow if you knew what foods were compatible with them first, what their dietary requirements were. She'd had to look over all the lists before trying to combine what other foods might be suitable for tomorrow's reformed group dinner. The last thing you wanted was an exotic experiment done on strangers in the family show dinner. The mother had said to the daughter, whilst they had said to the daughter, was the mother had said this to the daughter, whilst they took their roles in the washing and drying and putting up and putting away. The daughter had agreed that these strangers, that they didn't really know so well yet, needed family foods, foods that they knew that they would like to begin with, and they should really work with what was already familiar with them to begin with. What was familiar to the others, they are familiar with still because they've gotten to know some of their needs from their food shows. The daughter said that the mother could afford to be a little more adventurous on the later visits in her food choices, though. Otherwise, it's just the same old predictable vegetables and the things they're used to, the daughter had complained, turning then to look at the older man, still sat at the kitchen table, alongside some of the other students, and giving him a brief smile over the room. Although he was there busy listening to the other students, also sat there at the table, talking with them occasionally, whilst the women chatted around while they worked with themselves. The older visitor, Mr. Porter, had asked the visiting students what their studies all involved, feeling it was only fair since they had already heard the home students' studies. He also wanted to open up more about what his own studies were in his own previous years, and he agreed to listen to their final dissertation performances, even if he really couldn't live stream it at the time. Whatever it was about, he wasn't totally sure. He could understand a few of the students' ideas, and a few others he'd need to research much more before understanding. But he didn't give a full committal, more of a casual agreement that he would try and watch it if possible. And if he couldn't live stream at the time, then he'd certainly try and watch the recording highlights afterwards, he reassured them. The visiting student, introducing himself as Cybercat, who was a close friend of the student's son, of the mother. He was a common enough name in the virtual world, Cybercat, perhaps. Why didn't people just choose unique names anymore? Wondered the elderly visitor, though he didn't like to ask that. After the introductions, the titles and names and brief descriptions of each other were given. He was glad only his elder names were given by the mother to begin with. He didn't want them laughing at some of his earlier, childish names, no longer suitable from his earlier youth, or perhaps digging up stories, childish stories from the past. Cybercat, he said he was studying the phenomenal sci-show, whatever that was. He claimed it was an interactive psychiatric clinical house show. That was a controversial interactive show, something that was spawned a few years ago, he claimed. Oh yes, the elderly man nodded along, said he'd heard of it, didn't know much about it though, really. Cybercat said that show had featured many psychiatrists that were living with many of their patients. All had a range of different mental disorders, sometimes a combination of different disorders, and all were living in a public live stream house. For several months they would do so, or until they perhaps chose to leave some time, or perhaps got voted out for some reason, by a panel of psychiatrists who would decide, in an open assessment that would be viewed to the public, especially those interested in psychiatric studies. Even though all had given consent to participate, there was still some debate back then at the time whether this was really all just about psychological education and also had a therapeutic benefit too, both to the practitioners but also many of the patients that voluntarily chose as part of a therapy course to go online to the prescribed shows. Was it not merely drifting into entertainment also, some had feared, over the many months and years that the show had gone on for? And that was what he was essentially trying to study. The size shows and many of their other series had not necessarily live streamed anything that was really that terrible, not that mad, since there was a delay in the transmission of the actual live feed. So that if something that was perhaps too personal or too offensive or anything that was too illegal had occurred, then that could just simply be edited out before the transmission was actually broadcast. Any participants that had reacted badly to something, to being in the delayed live stream, that could merely be edited out. Anyone that was thought to have such a terrible bad reaction to being within the house could always be asked to leave, or could always choose to leave as well, until a future assessment had been done, and then it was thought for them okay by the panel of psychiatrists for them to later return into the house. And then was the revolving door cases. There were many. There were those that had mysteriously, for many reasons perhaps given, though not necessarily accepted, they had left the show. Only perhaps a few to return onto some later shows, with some explanation given as to what had happened. Others that had left the show, declaring themselves fully healed and gotten fully well. Later, they perhaps had been reassessed as being reasonably well to return, but they would still have some outstanding issues that hadn't perhaps been addressed during the earlier shows, something that had only later come to light, or something that later that they didn't know about to work on. So there was sometimes the return of old visitors to the show, sometimes with the old problems, being reassured in new circumstances now. Or a new problem would appear that they hadn't found out about before, that the old showings just hadn't noticed or hadn't come to light. The phenomenon of the psychiatry shows was a great thing, but it also had the spin-off shows too, those that made their own shows about how the show itself had affected them. Shows that followed patients returning to their old lives, going back to their old jobs, going back to old relationships and old houses. There were even other shows. Some psychiatrists were followed within too, also returning to their old practice, to their old jobs, often to their old patients, returning to live at their old houses with old partners too, and returning to old families, often returning to their old problems as well as their patients would. Yet with the new lessons learnt perhaps from the shows that they had participated in, and to try and teach perhaps some of the new lessons they felt they had learned. Well, that was the spin-off show's concept, the idea behind it even though many of the patients and the psychiatrist shows as well, on leaving the Psy show, felt that it was perhaps an unknown new situation that they were now going into, a new unknown life, because they'd been within the old Psy show for so long. Sometimes it was many months they were in there, and whilst they were so integrated in knowing everything going on with their patients or with their doctors within the house, they seemed to be more distant and to know much less about what was going on outside, beyond the house, and beyond the house's confines. More unknown then was the outside and their old way, their old friends and family, and their old patients and their old doctors they'd be returning to. More unknown than before, since their own families had also been watching and listening to them on the show as well, and they also didn't know what reaction many of them would have to them being on that show too. So too, it was difficult then to imagine not just how friends and family would react, but what about ex-partners, ex-friends, or people you just didn't get on with or had become estranged to now? What about how other strangers that you might meet might have felt watching you on those shows? There was a great number of real unknowns that people that had been on those shows would then wonder about. The reaction of strangers, yes. The reaction of acquaintances and of our own friends and family. And the reactions of people that we had once known long ago and fallen out of contact with as well. A great many things to wonder about for all of those that went on the shows. Wondering about how all of the different members of the public reacted to how people were on the show was a great thing that one worried and wondered about on leaving it. A great many watched and listened to it, especially if you knew someone that was on there. Even if you knew them a little bit, you might watch their highlights or some of their lowlights perhaps. And certainly, if they were close family, you might get to watch a lot more of it and decide to, if you had the time and energy and it permitted it. And of course, one's employers and potential employers would see it too. Managers, colleagues, people that you'd even worked with, and people that you were much more intimate with too. Even casual acquaintances would see you act and talk in a way that they had never seen you talk and act before and would be shocked. There were also the unknown, all those strangers that could listen to you, going into such a public, transparent place for however short a time, even though some went in for just weeks and others a few months. Well, no wonder it could be such a daunting prospect for anyone. Yes, for the psychiatrists, for all of the doctors that went on to the show, but also for all of the other patients that went on too. Whether it was really foolish or very brave, in fact, to go on there, or often maybe a little of both, people debated about, depending on the situation of the particular person. Was it brave or foolish to be just so open and just so honest for so long and in a public place, in a public show, watched by so many, watched by any number of people in your life? Anyone, anywhere could be watching. Was it really sensible to be talking about so many difficult, sensitive, embarrassing, shameful, fearful, depressing, angry, provocative things, personal things? Was it necessary sometimes, perhaps? It had to be argued, and it was debated, whether it was justifiable to do those things on some occasions, and whether on many other occasions perhaps it was not. And it was that provoked great debates, especially within the psychiatric community, but also in the broader public as well. It provoked a great many debates, both within specialised fields, within professions, but also within the public. Many people debated it openly, but many other people had their own personal debates and their own personal discussions about the whole issues. There was no end of participants who wanted to go on the show, of course. There were lots of people who volunteered for it, however long they lasted, whether it was days, weeks, or sometimes even months that people would participate. There was no end of fascination, of the bewildering amount of different kinds of disorders that could be. People that had obsessions about all sorts of different things, more things than one could ever imagine about. Obsessions about people, obsessions about information, obsessions about ideas of all different sorts. People obsessed with all different kinds of substances, people obsessive with different emotions and many different kinds of emotions. The show had morphed into multiple versions as the time went on over many years. Each of the different versions seemed to focus on more specific kinds of disorders, like specific kinds of obsessions, like there were the love obsessions. They were a show of love show obsessions, shows that had fanatics meeting those things that they were obsessed with or being surrounded by their obsessions to different extents. There were shows where fanatics could even meet their idols, who would then behave differently than they would imagine their behaviour to be, than what they had expected of them. Sometimes the perceived idol, that a fanatic, somebody obsessed with a person, the perceived idol was actually better sometimes than what they had expected of them. Many a time that they were much worse as well. But it was often that they had just behaved in unexpected ways, just in ways that they really had never expected them to. But not the saint the fan had thought. No, there were no saints anymore when you really got to meet them. People behaved in much more worse and better ways often than really people had expected. There were a number of these kinds of shows, all sorts of obsession shows, drunk love shows. They could be quite funny sometimes, strangely, although also they could be very sad as well in their stories. Then there were the Love Things show, where there were many groups of people who were hoarders of many different types of things. In some of the earlier shows, their challenges were that they had to live in houses where these things were gathered in great numbers. They were hoarded all around them in vast collections, rooms packed out with just great, grand, vast collections of things, vast numbers of things, and houses of things for them to live within. But those things gradually, as the time went on, slowly began to vanish. They vanished slowly over time, with rooms becoming more empty, shelves becoming empty, until there were finally empty houses that people were in. People alone in empty rooms, empty houses, in desperate search of anything to comfort them. People that left that show claimed they had appreciated having their simple things at home, things that they sometimes had taken for granted, just even their bed, and a comfortable bed at that, and the bedclothes, and their other ordinary clothes, and the chair to sit in, and all of the other cups and plates that they use, and the cutlery, and just cupboards to put things in nicely, and tables to eat off of, and comfortable chairs to relax in, and even carpets to feel soft underfoot, and interesting pictures. A simple picture that one had taken for granted at before could hold bewilderment and seem startling, dazzling, even in its simplicity. It seemed like a brilliant, beautiful, new look, after all the emptiness that they had gotten through for that time. In fact, they appreciated all the returning things, everything that they had in their old life that gradually returned, that gave them a renewed sense, a new type of comfort that they appreciated so much more. And they knew they could survive now without it, even for a short time. But perhaps they would somehow be poorer still without those things they also felt. All of the many spin-off official psychological shows that there were, each show had dealt with a different range of obsessions. Some patients had conveyor belts of different issues, of course, and featured on a whole variety of different shows. Sometimes you'd see familiar faces on one show that would later appear many months or years later on a quite different show, though with a related subject interest. And then there would be conveyor belts of different participants that would pass through on the same show, revolving door cases that would have the same issue that would later resurface another time. Sometimes a person appeared in a few of the different obsession shows because they had a great number of different, although related, obsessions. So they would take their turn, going from one show to another show until they had dealt with all the different kinds of obsessions in some sort of order of obsessional shows. It was a chance to meet many others on different shows as well, who might share similar obsessions and similar problems, and who also might share similar solutions to some of those issues too, have come up with similar coping strategies to some of those problems that were shared. That was the theory behind it for some of the participants too. They may have shared similar struggles to many of the others going on there, but of course they would have had their own different situations that they were coming from also. So a group of bibliophiles who all were perhaps obsessed by books and felt they couldn't live without them, they had perhaps agreed to live without books and without reading and writing for a short period of time. The bibliophiles had lived for a limited time without any books to read or to write or to listen to, perhaps to prove that they weren't obsessed with books to themselves or others, or just to know that they could live without those books, without reading books, writing books, or without listening to books. If they needed to, they could survive without it. Yes, some of them felt they'd be poorer without it, having done weeks or months, but still they knew at least they could depend on themselves without it, and they weren't necessarily addicted to it, however much some of them felt their lives were much poorer sometimes without having access to writing and reading and listening to a great many others' books. Others went in for filming addictions rather than the book addictions, perhaps feeling they had a filmaholia, as it was called back then, and even others had gaming addictions or gameaholics. Talking addictions were other ones, and others felt there were debating addictions. The filmaholics agreed to try and live without any filming for a limited time within a house, in a non-filming house show, so they would no longer be able to film others or watch others' films. And ironically enough, at the end of their time in the filmaholics show, they then had to later watch a show. Indeed, they were watching a film of their journey during their filmaholism. A film about their experiences during that time, their journey out of filmaholism. And during that time, they could give some feedback and talk about their experiences, and others within it too could talk about their experiences. Overtalkers had similar challenges of having to actively listen to long speeches or trialogues sometimes. And then at the end of that show, they had to give a long talk to prove that they had really been absorbing and listening to what was being said by many others, and not just passively listening along, phasing in and out. They then had to report back a general gist of what had been said to give a concise summary of the important points in their own understanding. Such different psychological shows were introduced, and so many disordered housemates had many experiences within the shows. Yet each may be disordered in their own particular, unique way. Though having some discernible disorders, perhaps they were trying to understand. Some of the disorders were perhaps more obvious than others. Others didn't seem to be disorders themselves, or perhaps they were more socially acceptable in the social circles those people had moved within. They were not perhaps so obvious always to the audience as well as to the participants themselves. There were obsessive cleaners, for example, that were sent to live for a week in a dirty house show. That was perhaps a very cluttered and messy house with things all over the place. They were sometimes very confused, believing, some of them, that you just couldn't be too clean, that cleaning wasn't something you could be too obsessive about. Yet it was a house full of mud that really wouldn't have harmed them too much. And their doctors would turn up to smear mud on the carpets and sometimes sofa fabrics and onto the walls and all over the place. And they even drew funny pictures onto the wallpaper and all sorts of things. Nothing that was causing any real problem to the participants themselves, even when they were throwing buckets of mud all over the place. Hygienically, the cleaners themselves were not at risk. The participants were not either, as they took care to wash themselves and their food. And they did wash up the clothes and the kitchen utensils well, in limited areas of the house they were able to. By the end of the show, they were pouring buckets of mud down the stairs and slipping and sliding, and mud and dirt and dust and all sorts. And they were wading through it at times, in all slop and slime of it, but it wasn't getting inside of them and causing them any serious problems. It was poured about everywhere, with shattered, broken pieces of ornaments that had once been all lined up neatly in a nice gathered collection, that were now just thrown to pieces on the floor in a meaningless charade. You'd find them in the gardens too, tattered, broken, torn pieces of clothing and books scattered all about the place, everything in different places and rooms that should never have been, that just didn't really need to be where they were. Nothing in the house seemed to make sense anymore. Things were gradually being moved more about the place in disordered ways than it had ever been as the hours and the weeks wore on the show. Only after the residents had long enough time to enjoy the orderly house as it had been did the disorderly things begin. The disorderers had begun just moving a few ornaments here and there, disappearing a few things, swapping a few things around, knocking a few things over, moving things from different room to different room. Kitchen things appeared in the bathroom things appeared in the garden things appeared in the lounge things appeared in the street, things from the street appeared in the theatre, things from the theatre appeared anywhere. And things kept moving more and more as the time went on. Things got broken more and more, and gradually the disorderers moved more things and broke more things in a slow and gradual process as the weeks wore on in the disordering house. You'd find things more broken and more disorderly and more confused as the weeks wore on, as the participants did themselves. They didn't know that this would happen. It was a surprise because it was the first series that the disorderers had begun in their treatment program. The first time they'd had that within the show, it was a shock to the participants themselves to see the things gradually happening. They just hadn't known that those things would happen. The Disorderers series, as it became known, like all the others, they worked only on the first showing, because it worked on that shock element to begin with. They had to change it for other series, but there were other shocks to do for other series. Unless the participants themselves hadn't seen the past series or knew little to nothing about it themselves. If the participants knew that it was only going to be a temporary inconvenience, though, or that the antiques that were being smashed onto the floor were really just mass-produced items, just replicas of those, cheap to produce and worthless in and of themselves, and an abundance of them, and not really antiques that were being smashed all around them everywhere, then it would have lost the shock factor. There were a whole variety of those disorderly shows. The visiting student had reported this to the elderly man, Mr. Porter, who'd been listening in, really quite amazed to learn about these things, having never heard about those type of shows before himself, never mind study them. And also, he'd not heard of the spin-off shows either, those smaller shows, the personalised, disorderly shows, with the participants attempting their own shows, narrating their own post-show journeys, how the shows had affected them, and how they were able to go out into the world post-show, out to the followers. There also were the personal shows between the returning patients and their families too. Some made the family shows for the public. Others chose not to have those follow-up shows at all, not seeing it as that necessary for them. The elderly visitor was more interested in the student visitors' explorations of the interactive showings. He'd not really heard that much about those interactive shows that involved the audience participation with the films they were showing. And he said that he thought about perhaps going on one of the shows himself if he got to know much more about the particular show. Or perhaps he could go on a number of relevant shows to his conditions if they got to know much more about what those were. But he didn't say anything about what they were specifically. No, he didn't think it was appropriate, not casually talking with them at the family table, in front of the family. Or he dreamt about going on the shows, he admitted. But was it just a dream, some idle fantasy, something he might casually do one day, but had never given serious enough thought about doing it really? Well, perhaps he just didn't know enough about it yet to give it serious thought. Or was love obsession something that was a potential? Had he had obsessive loves himself in the past, enough to go on such a show? Didn't everyone have obsessive loves in their life at some point? Or was that just a few people? Or didn't everyone want to talk about those things? He just didn't know, really. Was it just something he thought about and dreamt about? Or did everyone have those great obsessions about things they were fearful of, as well as things they loved too? Avoiding talking about what kind of disorderly shows that he would probably qualify for, and a great number, he instead asked the students about the range of different psychological shows that they knew of, the ones they were studying, and he was amazed at the sheer amount of the different new shows that there were. Finally, after hearing him out, the elder had asked about the purpose of all these studies. Well, what's the purpose of these explorations? He asked. He asked the students. The students said to try and get a better understanding of the effects of those different shows on society and on the individual too, and to learn what support they can also give when going into practice psychology, especially if it's a psychology show in the future. A couple of the students said they were thinking about perhaps going into. If his explorations are approved by the relevant panel of the university psychiatrists, claimed the student, whatever those were, the elderly visitor wasn't sure. Well, it seemed like a worthwhile study, perhaps, the elderly visitor said, nodding along. Hearing that he'd only be doing some private psychological shows. He said that he would only do those for a year or so. That's how long the studies would last, the student said. Whilst he would be monitored by some of the older professional psychologists at the university, they would monitor him as he was going along during his studies. He would only go into such a public treatment house after a long time of training and experience also, the student had claimed, almost to try and reassure himself as much as the elderly man that he was talking to. After his discussions with the other students, the elder man then left the two younger student friends to their studies or whatever other things they were talking about, although they seemed, on later reflection, to be perhaps now studying each other, glancing and looking over to each other for a long time, reacquainting each other perhaps after a long absence, with his student friend away studying at the other campus perhaps, and seeing the house daughter that had been fluttering around, cleaning up around the mother, had now left the kitchen, as a governess figure going off to nanny with the other children, for another cleaning up show perhaps, before their evening dream songs later on, whatever that was. The mother was now out in the back garden, going out the door, collecting up all the wigs and the hats and the robes and all the costumes and the different props, folding them up and pushing them back into the old dressing up box that the children had neglected to return to the box, left out strewn about the bushes and hanging off branches and left on the lawn. She didn't want them leaving out to get damp and wet in case it rained during the night perhaps, fearing it might later, and that the costumes could get spoilt if left out. I really must get some company for him, said the mother, coming in from the garden outside, returning to the kitchen. Once it was all put away and folded up neatly, and the rabbit put into his hutch into a small stretch of the lawn. She'd not seen any foxes out about anyway, but you never knew, good to put him away. For who? Said the elderly man, looking up from the kitchen table. And he looked back to the kitchen back door of the garden, where the mother was now stood. Their mother had been addressing her son, in actual fact, but he was now looking into the student friend's computer. They were looking into their computer screens, and too much to hear or notice her talking. So the elderly visitor had thought maybe she was telling him this, or telling the room. Didn't she notice her own son was so engrossed with his student friend and their talk? Roger the children's rabbit, explained the mother. Been on his own a few months, she said, glancing out to the dark kitchen door and the garden beyond. I suppose that's a long time in their world, supposed the mother, thinking about it. Maybe I could take him to an animal rescue show, something, she muttered. Send him off to Rabbit World or somewhere, she asked, as if asking the room. But she looked over to the elderly man, sat there pondering, unsure how to respond. The mother had said it light-heartedly, going now to make an evening drink for herself, and seeing that she seemed happy and okay enough, the elderly man now offered her a little of the drink that he brought himself as a gift and an offering too, as kindness for her giving him the dinner earlier on, and perhaps also that he wanted her to share what he was doing too, wanted her to join him for a couple of drinks. And after the request, she agreed, Since it was so late, most of the work was done now, the older children were looking after the younger ones. Perhaps she could rest after her weary day's working, and rest for the day with him. It's just that the children have gotten so attached to him now, said the mother, looking out to the dark kitchen door again, going to it to lock up once more. They want to find him a partner, she explained. Oh, said the elderly man. So you're a matchmaker for the animals too, laughed the elderly man. The mother laughed a little too. I'm an introducer. I don't think I'm a matchmaker that much. Well, not that I made it that much, really, she said, explaining that she had introduced a few friends, but not often. She was still smiling a little, now with the drinks all made. Yet the elder seemed a little concerned about something. Well, I've tried to find partners for some friends. In the end, they found them themselves, explained the mother. Well, some of them, she said. And so you're trying to partner me up, said the older man. He asked this, now content that the younger students were so immersed in their own discussion that he was more or less talking alone with the mother, even in the room with them talking also. You said that you wanted to partner up. Well, I thought that's what you wanted, explained the mother. From our earlier conversations, she explained. I said in an ideal world, yet in another time, began the older man, then trying to remember the many different things he had said during their many sessions, their many discussions. Well, when is it ever a perfect time? Asked the mother, holding the drinks of them both, looking over to her son also, seeing him with his friend in their deep talk together, into some kind of laughing show, both laughing with each other, besides each other at the table. Maybe we should have a private talk about this, said the mother, now seeing that the students were laughing out loud, and that the elder man was trying to talk perhaps about something more serious, more personal. Perhaps it was a struggle to hear the mumbler, because he could talk quiet, with the background hyenas all laughing about him. The elder man agreed to go to a private room for a private discussion in the family house, to discuss with her his own issues. Before they left the kitchen, the mother had told her son and her son's friend, Don't show too late, guys. We're shop showing in the morning, she reminded the son. She always needed more shows, so was he. So were all of them, in fact. Weren't they all needing more shows? She'd have to go show shopping with him tomorrow, getting all the fresh, up-to-date shows, just that were new for them, relevant for them today. For all their needs were changing so often now. When the needs changed so much, they needed to shop so much more, to keep things so much more fresher.